Hello, and welcome back to another episode in our Plato reading streams. We are now beginning Book 6 out of Book 10 of Plato's Republic. The last one was a doozy. Here's the short version. The book in general was another lengthier talk about the nature of the city and its people. This time it talked about the education of women, and also about the distribution of marriage and sex, and it was all rather dystopic, so we won't bother with that. They also touched on warfare, and how war should be carried out depending on whether they're talking with other Greeks or whether they're at war with non-Greeks. Not very interesting, to be honest. But then they touched on a much more complicated bit of philosophy. And they talked about the topic of knowledge versus opinion. And they came to the conclusion that knowledge is regards what is. It regards actuality, being things that actually are, rather than mere examples of what things are. Such as there are many beautiful things, but knowing beautiful things is not knowledge of the beautiful itself. And someone who is a philosopher is someone who seeks to learn about the itself part. And we haven't got to it yet, but I suspect what they're leading towards is that this is the theory of forms, the form of something, rather than merely it's the shadow of something, what an example of what it is, rather than it itself. The other thing they call opinion, and they say it is an intermediary between ignorance and knowledge. It doesn't have true knowledge. That's what they were going with, and they're probably going to continue that today, I imagine. So let's dive into it. The last one, I have noticed that these books have been getting increasingly difficult as they've gone on, so if the last one was as difficult as it was, this next one is going to be even harder, and we'll have to pay close attention if we hope to understand it. And I'll read a little bit about from the previous book, just a paragraph, to catch up where we was last time. That's necessary too. Shall we say, then, that these people who love and embrace, they embrace the things that knowledge is set over, as the others do the things that opinion is set over? Remember, we said that the latter saw and loved beautiful sounds and colours and the like, but wouldn't allow the beautiful itself to be anything. We remember, all right? We won't be in error, then, if we call such people lovers of opinion rather than philosophers, or lovers of wisdom and knowledge. Will they be angry with us if we call them that? Oh, not if they take my advice, for it isn't right to be angry with those who speak the truth. And as for those who in each case embrace the thing itself, we must call them philosophers, not lovers of opinion. Most definitely. Book 6. And so, Glaucon, I said, after a somewhat lengthy and difficult discussion, both the philosophers and the non-philosophers came to light as who they are. It probably wouldn't have been easy, he said, to have them do it in a shorter one. Apparently not, but for my part, I think that the matter would have been better illuminated if we had only it to discuss, and not all the other things that remain to be treated in order to discover the difference between the just life and the unjust one. Well, what's our next topic? What else but the one that's next in order? Since those who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects are philosophers, while those who are not able to do so and who wander among the many things that vary in every sort of way are not philosophers, Which of the two should be leaders in a city? What would be a sensible answer to that? We should establish as guardians those who are clearly capable of guarding the laws and the ways of life of the city. That's right. And it isn't clear that a guardian who is able to keep watch over anything should be keen-sighted rather than blind. Oh, sorry, it isn't it clear that they should be keen-sighted and rather than blind. If I can get to the next page. Of course it's clear. Do you think, then, that there's any difference between the blind and those who are really deprived of the knowledge of each thing that is? The latter have no clear model in their souls, and so they cannot, in the manner of painters, look to what is most true, make constant reference to it, and study it as exactly as possible. Hence, they cannot establish here on Earth conventions about what is fine or just or good when they need to be established, or guard and preserve them once they have been established. No, by God, there isn't much difference between them. Should we then make these blind people our guardians and rulers? Or rather those who know each thing that is, and who are not inferior to others, either in experience or in any part of virtue? It would be absurd to choose anyone but the ones who have knowledge. Indeed, if indeed they're not inferior in these ways, for the respect in which they are superior is pretty well the most important one. Then, shouldn't we explain how it is possible for people to come to have both these sorts of qualities? Certainly. Then, as we said in the beginning of this discussion, it is necessary to understand first the nature of the ones who are going to come to have both sorts. For I think that if we can reach adequate agreements about that, we'll also agree that the same people can have both qualities, and that no one but they should be leaders in cities. How so? Let's agree that philosophic natures always love the sort of learning that makes clear to them some feature of the being that always is, and does not wander around between coming to be and decaying. Sorry, I got distracted for a moment then. I wasn't paying attention to what I read. I'm just going to read that last section again. Let's agree that philosophic natures always love the sort of learning that makes clear to them some feature of the being that always is, and does not wander around between coming to be and decaying. And further, let's agree, like the honour lovers and erotically inclined men we've described before, they love all such learning and are not willing to give up any part of it, whether large or small, more valuable or less so. That's right. Consider next whether the people we're describing must also have this in their nature. What? They must be without falsehood. They must refuse to accept what is false, hate it, and have a love for the truth. That's a reasonable addition, at any rate. It's not only reasonable, it's entirely necessary. For it's necessary for a man who is erotically inclined by nature to love everything akin to or belonging to the boy he loves. That's right. And could you find anything that belongs more to wisdom than truth does? Of course not. Then is it possible for the same nature to be a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, and a lover of falsehood? No, not at all. Then someone who loves learning must, above all, strive for every kind of truth from childhood on. Absolutely. Now, we surely know that when someone's desires incline strongly for one thing, they are thereby weakened for others, just like a stream that has been partly diverted into another channel. Of course. This just sounds like a really long tangent just to say that being gay is as true as being a philosopher. You know, You're probably right there. That would be perfectly on brand for Socrates. Socrates has always said, he says, so, and he quotes, he says, "There are two things in my life that I love: Alcibiades and philosophy." Those are the words of Socrates from the horse's mouth. Of course. Then, when someone's desires flow towards learning, and everything of that sort, they'd be concerned, I suppose, with the pleasures of the soul itself, by itself, and they'd abandon those pleasures that come through the body, if indeed he is a true philosopher and not merely a counterfeit one. That's completely necessary. Then surely such a person is moderate, and not at all a money lover. It's appropriate for others to take seriously the things for which money and large expenditures are needed, but not for him. That's right. And of course, there's also this to consider when you are judging whether a nature is philosophic or not. What's that? If it's at all slavish, you should not overlook that fact, for pettiness is altogether incompatible with a soul that is always reaching out to grasp everything both divine and human as a whole. That's completely true. And will a thinker high-minded enough to study all time and all being consider human life to be something important? Oh, he couldn't possibly. Then will he consider death to be a terrible thing? Oh, he least of all. Then it seems a cowardly and slavish nature will take no part in true philosophy. Oh, not in my opinion. And is there any way that an orderly person, who isn't money-loving, slavish, a boaster, or a coward, could become unreliable or unjust? There isn't. Moreover, when you are looking to see whether a soul is philosophic or not, you'll look to see whether it is just and gentle from youth on, or savage and hard to associate with. Certainly. And here's something I think you won't leave out. What's that? Whether he's a slow learner or a fast one. Or do you ever expect anyone to love something when it pains him to do it, and when much effort brings only small return? No, it couldn't happen. Well, I disagree. I'm quite a slow learner myself. And what if he could retain nothing of what he learned because he was full of forgetfulness? Could he fail to be empty of knowledge? How could he? Then don't you think that if he's labouring in vain, he'd inevitably come to hate both himself and that activity in the end? Of course. Then let's never include a forgetful soul among those who are sufficiently philosophical for our purposes, but look for one with a good memory. Absolutely. Now, we'd certainly say that the unmusical and graceless elements in a person's nature draw him to lack of due measure. Of course. And do you think that truth is akin to what lacks due measure? Or to what is measured? I'm not sure what he means here by measure, but so I'm going to just read that again in hopes that we can understand it. Then let's never include a forgetful song among those. Absolutely. Now, we absolutely say that the unmusical and graceless element in a person's nature draws him to lack of due measure. Of course. And do you think that truth is akin to what lacks due measure, or to what is measured? To what is measured. Then, in addition to those other things, let's look for someone whose thought is, by nature, measured and graceful, and easily led to the form of each thing that is. Of course. Well then, don't you think that the properties we've enumerated are compatible with one another, and that each is necessary to a soul that is to have an adequate and complete grasp of that which is? They're all completely necessary. Is there any objection you can find, then, to a pursuit that no one can adequately follow unless he's by nature good at remembering, quick to learn, high-minded, graceful, and a friend and relative of truth, justice, courage, and moderation? Not even Momus could find one. Momus is a personification of blame and censure. Not even Momus could find one. When such people have reached maturity and age and education, wouldn't you entrust the city to them and to them alone? And Adamantus replied, "No one would be able to contradict the things you've said, Socrates, but on each occasion that you say them, your hearers are affected in some way as this. They think that, because they're inexperienced in asking and answering questions, they're led astray a little bit by the argument at each question. When these little bits are added together at the end of the discussion, great is their fall, as the opposite of what they've said at the outset comes to light. Just as inexperienced checker players are trapped by the expert in the end and can't make a move. So they too are trapped in the end and have nothing to say in this different kind of checkers, which is played not with discs but with words. Yet the truth isn't affected by this outcome. I say this with a view to the present case, for someone might well say now that he's unable to oppose you, as you ask each of your questions, yet he sees that of all those who take up philosophy, not those who merely dabble in it while still young, in order to complete their upbringing and then drop it, but those who continue in it for a longer time, the greatest number become cranks, not to say completely vicious, while those who seem completely decent are rendered useless to the city because of the studies you recommend." Oh, we got the brutal critique coming out here from Adamantus. I think this is relating to "in due measure." That was what was said at the start. So it's just saying "as appropriate." I see. I'll try to keep that in mind. Due measure. Not a common word I use. When I'd heard him out, I said, "Do you think that what these people say is false?" "I don't know, but I'd be glad to hear what you think." "You'd hear, then, that they seem to me to speak the truth." "How, then, can it be true to say that there will be no end to the evils in our cities until philosophers, people we agree to be useless, rule in them?" "The question you ask needs to be answered by means of an image or simile." "And you, of course, aren't used to speaking in similes." "So, are you making fun of me now that you've landed me with a claim that's so hard to establish? In any case, listen to my simile, and you'll appreciate all the more how greedy for images I am. What the most decent people experience in relation to their city is so hard to bear that there's no other experience like it. Hence, to find an image of it, and a defence for them, I must construct it from many sources, just as painters paint goat stags by combining features of different things. Imagine, then, that something like the following happens on a ship, or on many ships. The ship owner is bigger and stronger than everyone else on board, but he's hard of hearing and a bit short-sighted, and his knowledge of seafaring is equally deficient. The sailors are quarrelling with one another about steering the ship. Each of them thinks that he should be the captain, even though he's never learned the art of navigation, cannot point to anyone who taught it to him, or to a time when he learned it. Indeed, they claim that it isn't teachable, and are ready to cut to pieces anyone who says that it is. They're always crowding around the ship owner, begging him and doing everything possible to get him to turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes, if they don't succeed in persuading him, they execute the ones who do succeed and throw them overboard, and then, having stupefied their noble ship owner with drugs, wine, or some other way, they rule the ship, using up what's in it and sailing while drinking and feasting, in the way that people like that are prone to do. Moreover, they call the person who is clever at persuading or forcing the ship owner to let them rule a navigator, a captain, one who knows ships, and dismiss anyone else as useless, They don't understand that a true ship captain must pay attention to the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, and all that pertains to his craft, if he's really to be the ruler of a ship. And they don't believe there is any craft that would enable him to determine how he would steer a ship. Whether the others want to or not, or any possibility of mastering this alleged craft, or of practicing it at the time, as the craft of navigation. Don't you think that the true captain will be called a real stargazer, a babbler, and a good-for-nothing by those who sail in ships governed in that way, in which such things happen? I certainly do. Well, you have to forgive me about that simile there. I got the inflection wrong near the end. But, I think the picture is drawn. I don't think you need to examine the simile in detail to see that the ships resemble cities, and their attitude to true philosophers, but you already understand what I mean. Indeed I do. Then first tell this simile to anyone who wonders why philosophers aren't honoured in cities, and try to persuade him that there would be far more cause for wonder if they were honoured. I will tell him. Next, tell him what he says is true, that the most decent among the philosophers are useless to the majority. Tell him not to blame those decent people for this, but the ones who don't make use of them. It isn't natural for the captain to beg the sailors to be ruled by him, nor for the wise to knock at the doors of the rich. The man who came up with that wisecrack made a mistake. The natural thing is for the sick person, rich or poor, to knock at the doctor's door, and for anyone who needs to be ruled, to knock at the door of the one who can rule him. It isn't for the ruler, if he's truly any use, to beg others to accept his rule. Tell him that he'll make no mistake in likening those who rule in our cities, at present, to the sailors we've mentioned just now, and those who are called useless stargazers to the true captains. That's absolutely right. Therefore, it isn't easy for the best ways of life to be highly esteemed by people who, as in these circumstances, follow the opposite ways. By far the greatest and most serious slander on philosophy, however, results from those who profess to follow the philosophic ways of life. I mean those of whom the prosecutor of philosophy declared that the greatest number are completely vicious and the most decent useless. And I admitted that what he said was true, didn't I? Yes. And we haven't explained why the decent ones are useless. Indeed. Then, do you want us to discuss why it's inevitable that the greater number are vicious, and try to show, if we can, that philosophy isn't responsible for this either? Certainly. Ouch. I'll drink some water. I have to change my water filter, I think. It's starting to taste like tap water again. Where was I? Certainly. Then let's begin our dialogue by reminding ourselves of the point at which we began to discuss the nature that someone must have if he's to become a fine and decent person. First of all, if you remember, he had to be guided by the truth, and always pursue it in every way, or else he'd really be a boaster with no share at all in true philosophy. That's what was said. And isn't this view completely contrary to the opinions currently held about him? It certainly is. Then, won't it be reasonable for us to plead in his defence that it is the nature of a real lover of learning to struggle towards what is, not to remain with any of the many things that are believed to be, that as he moves on, he neither loses nor lessens his erotic love, until he grasps the being of each nature itself, with the part of his soul that is fitted to grasp it, because of his kinship with it, and that, once getting near what really is, and having intercourse with it, and having begotten understanding and truth, he knows, truly lives, and is nourished, and, at that point, but not before, is relieved from the pain of giving birth. It's a very strange metaphor, but very well. That's the most reasonable defence possible. Well, Will such a person have any part in the love of falsehood, or will he entirely hate it? Oh, he'll hate it, of course. And if truth led the way, we'd never say, I suppose, that a chorus of evils could ever follow in its train. How could it? But rather a healthy and just character, with moderation following it. That's right. What need is there, then, to marshal, all over again from the beginning, the members of the philosophic nature's chorus in their inevitable array? Remember that courage, high-mindedness, ease in learning, and good memory all belong to it. Then you objected, saying that anyone would be compelled to agree with what we said, but that if he abandoned the argument and looked at the very people the argument is about, he'd say that some of them were useless, while the majority had every kind of vice. So we examined the reason for this slander, and we have now arrived at the point of explaining why the majority of them are bad. And it's for this reason that we've again taken up the nature of the true philosophers, and defined what is necessarily it has to be. That's true. We must now look at the ways in which this nature is corrupted, how it's destroyed in many people, while a small number, those who are called useless rather than bad, manage to escape. After that, we must look in turn at the nature of souls that imitate the philosophic nature, and establish themselves in pursuits, so as to see what the people are like who thereby arrive at pursuits they are unworthy of, and that is beyond them, and who, because they often strike false notes, bring upon philosophy the reputation that you said it has with everyone everywhere. Very well. In what ways is this nature corrupted? I'll try to enumerate them for you if I can. I suppose that everyone would agree that only a few possess all the qualities that we just now said were essential to becoming a complete philosopher, and that seldom occur naturally among human beings. Well, don't you think so? I certainly do. Consider, then, the many important ways in which these few can be corrupted. What are they? What will surprise you most when you hear it is that each of these things we praised in the nature tends to corrupt the soul that has it, and to drag it away from philosophy. I mean courage, moderation, and the other things we mentioned. That does sound strange. Furthermore, all the things that are said to be good also corrupt it and drag it away. Beauty, wealth, physical strength, relatives who are powerful in the city, and all that goes with those. You understand what I have in mind? I do, and I'd be glad to learn about it more precisely. Correctly grasp the general point I'm after, and it will be clear to you, and what I've said before won't seem at all strange. What do you want me to do? We know that the more vigorous any seed, developing plant, or animal is, the more it is deficient in those things that are appropriate for it to have, when it is deprived of suitable food, season, or location. For the bad is more opposed to the good than it is to the merely not good. Of course. Then it's reasonable to say that the best natures fare worse, when unsuitably nurtured, than an ordinary one. It is. Then won't we say the same about souls too, Adamantus? That those with the best natures become outstandingly bad when they receive a bad upbringing? Or do you think that great injustices and pure wickedness originate in an ordinary nature rather than in a vigorous one that has been corrupted by its upbringing? Or that a weak nature is ever the cause of either great good or great evil? No, you're right. That's an interesting argument there. Because I certainly agree that someone who has a weak nature is incapable of either great good or great evil. He has quite a weak nature. But a vigorous nature to be either greatly good or greatly evil, I guess it follows, if indeed that's how it works. That's an interesting argument. No, you're right. Now, I think that philosophic nature, as we've defined it, it will inevitably grow to possess every virtue if it happens to receive appropriate instruction. But if it is sown, planted, and grown in an inappropriate environment, it will develop into quite the opposite way, unless some god happens to come to its rescue. Or do you agree with the general opinion that certain young people are actually corrupted by sophists? That there are certain sophists with significant influence on the young who corrupt them through private teaching? Isn't it rather the very people who say this who are the greatest sophists of all? Since they educate most completely, turning young and old men and women into precisely the kind of people they want them to be. Oh, when do they do that? When many of them are sitting together in assemblies, courts, theatres, army camps, or in some other public gathering of the crowd. They object very loudly and excessively to some of the things that are said or done, and approve others in the same way, shouting and clapping, so that the very rocks and surroundings echo the din of their praise or blame, and double it. In circumstances like that, what is the effect, as they say, on a young person's heart? What private training can hold out and not be swept away by that kind of praise or blame and be carried away by the flood wherever it goes, so that he'll say the same things are beautiful or ugly as the crowd does, follow the same pursuits as they do, and be the same sort of person as they are? Oh, he'll be under great compulsion to do so, Socrates. And yet we haven't mentioned the greatest compulsion of all. What's that? It's what these educators and sophists impose by their actions if their words fail to persuade. Or don't you know that they punish anyone who isn't persuaded with disenfranchisement, fines, or death? They most certainly do. What other sophists, then, or what private conversations, do you think will prevail in opposition to these? Oh, I don't suppose any will. No, indeed. It would be very foolish even to try to oppose them, for there isn't now, hasn't been in the past, nor ever will in the future, anyone with a character so unusual that he has been educated to virtue in spite of the contrary education he received from the mob. I mean, a human character, the divine as the saying goes, is an exception to the rule. You should realise that if anyone is saved and becomes what he ought to be under our present constitutions, he has been saved, you might say, by divine dispensation. I agree. Well then, you should also agree to this. And what's that? Not one of those paid private teachers, whom the people call sophists, and consider to be their rivals in craft, teaches anything other than the convictions that the majority express when they are gathered together. Indeed, these are precisely what the sophists call wisdom. It's as if someone were learning the moods and appetites of a huge, strong beast that he's rearing, how to approach and handle it when it is most difficult to deal with, or most gentle, and what makes it so. What sounds it utters in either condition, and what sounds soothe or anger it. Having learned all this through tending the beast over a period of time, he calls this knack wisdom, gathers his information together as if it were a craft, and starts to teach it. In truth, he knows nothing about which of these convictions is fine or shameful, good or bad, just or unjust, but he applies all the names in accordance with how the beast reacts, calling what it enjoys good, what angers it bad. He has no other account to give of these terms. And he calls what he is compelled to do just and fine, for he hasn't seen, and cannot show anyone else, how much compulsion and goodness really differ. Don't you think, by God, that someone like that is a strange educator? Oh, I do indeed. Then does this person seem any different from the one who believes that it is wisdom to understand the moods and pleasures of a majority gathered from all quarters? Whether they concern painting, music, or for the matter, politics? If anyone approaches the majority to exhibit his poetry, or some other piece of craftsmanship or service to his city, and gives them mastery over him to any degree beyond what's unavoidable, he'll be under Diomedian compulsion, as it's called, to do the sort of thing which they approve. But have you ever heard anyone presenting an argument that such things are truly good and beautiful that wasn't absolutely ridiculous? No, and I don't expect ever to hear one. Keeping all this in mind, recall the following question. Can the majority in any way tolerate or accept the reality of the beautiful itself, as opposed to the many beautiful things, or the reality of each thing itself, as opposed to the corresponding many? Not in any way. Then the majority cannot be philosophic. They cannot. Hence, they inevitably disapprove of those who practice philosophy. Inevitably. And so do all those private individuals who associate with the majority and try to please them. Clearly. Then, because of that, do you see any salvation for someone who is by nature a philosopher? To ensure that he'll practice philosophy correctly to the end. Yes, the classic Socrates hates the people roots. Sophists, above all. Then, because of all that, do you see any salvation for someone who is by nature a philosopher? To ensure that he'll practice philosophy correctly to the end. Think about what we've said before. We agreed that ease in learning, a good memory, courage, and high-mindedness belong to the philosophic nature. Yes. And won't someone with a nature like that be first among the children in everything, especially if his body has a nature that matches his soul? How could he not? Then, I suppose that as he gets older, his family and fellow citizens will want to make use of him in connection with their own affairs. Of course. Therefore, they'll pay court to him with their requests and honours, trying by their flattery to secure for themselves ahead of time the power that is going to be his. That's what usually happens at any rate. What do you think someone like that will do in such circumstances? Especially if he happens to be from a great city, in which he's rich, well-born, good-looking and tall. Won't he be filled with impractical expectations, and think himself capable of managing the affairs, not only of the Greeks, but of the barbarians as well? And as a result, won't he exalt himself to great heights, and be brimming with pretension and pride that is empty and lacks understanding? He certainly will. And if someone approaches a young man in that condition, and gently tells him the truth, namely, that there's no understanding in him, that he needs it, and that it can't be acquired unless he works like a slave to attain it, do you think it'll be easy for him to listen when he's in the midst of so many evils? Oh, far from it. And even if a young man of that sort somehow sees the point, and is guided and drawn to philosophy because of his noble nature and his kinship with reason, what do you think those people will do if they believe that they're losing their use of him and his companionship? Is there anything they won't do or say to him to prevent him from being persuaded? Or anything they won't do or say about his persuader, whether plotting against him in private, or even publicly bringing him into court to prevent him from such persuasion? There certainly isn't. Then, is there any chance that such a person will practice philosophy? Oh, not at all. Do you see, then, that we weren't wrong to say that when someone with a philosophic nature is badly brought up, the very components of his nature, with the other so-called goods, such as wealth and other similar advantages, are themselves, in a way, the cause of his falling away from philosophic pursuits? I do, and what was said was right. Where are we now? 40 minutes. Let me try and think. Let me do the maths in my head. I think we're halfway through the book. So I'm going to catch my breath here so that I'll be better off for the second half. I'll be back in a few minutes. Yeah. All right, we're back. Let's get into the second half. The way these books seem to have been going for the past 5 books is that the first half is really quite light, not very sort of a lot of fluff, but the second half is a lot more dense. So I suspect we'll be seeing a similar thing. Where was we? Prevented from such persuasion, practice philosophy. Blah, blah, blah. Oh yes, okay. We were just talking about how the philosopher will be corrupted, and then anyone who tries to uncorrupt him will be shoved away. Then is there any chance that such a person will practice philosophy? Oh, none at all. Do you see, then, that we weren't wrong to say that when someone with a philosophic nature is badly brought up, the very components of his nature, together with the other so-called goods, such as wealth and other similar advantages, are themselves, in a way, the cause of his falling away from philosophic pursuits? I do, and what was said was right. These, then, are the many ways in which the best nature, which is already rare enough, as we've said, is destroyed and corrupted, so that it cannot follow the best pursuits. And it is among these men that we find the ones who do the greatest evils to cities and individuals, and also, if they happen to be swept that way by the current, the greatest good, for a petty nature will never do anything great, either to an individual or a city. That's very true. When these men, for whom philosophy is most appropriate, fall away from her, they leave her desolate and unwed, and they themselves lead lives that are inappropriate and untrue. Then others who are unworthy of her come to her as to an orphan deprived of the protection of kinsmen, and disgrace her. These are the ones who are responsible for the reproaches that you say are cast upon philosophy by those who revile her. Namely, that some of those who consort with her are useless, while the majority deserve to suffer many bad things. Yes, that is indeed what is said. And it's a reasonable thing to say, for other little men, the ones who are most sophisticated at their own little crafts, seeing that this position, which is full of fine names and adornments, is vacated, leap gladly from those little crafts to philosophy, like prisoners escaping from jail who take refuge in a temple. Despite her present poor state, philosophy is still more high-minded than these other crafts, so that many people with defective natures desire to possess her, even though their souls are cramped and spoiled by the mechanical nature of their work, in just the way that their bodies are mutilated by their crafts and labours. Isn't that inevitable? It certainly is. Don't you think that a man of this sort looks exactly like a little bald-headed tinker who has come into some money and, having been released from jail, has taken a bath, put on a new cloak, got himself a bridegroom, and is about to marry the boss's daughter because she is poor and abandoned? They're exactly the same. And what kind of children will that marriage produce? Won't they be illegitimate and inferior? They have to be. Not sure what he means by that, but what about men who are unworthy of education, and approach philosophy, and consort with her unworthily? What kinds of thoughts and opinions are we to say they beget? Won't they truly be what is properly called sophism? Things that have nothing genuine about them, or worthy of being called true wisdom. That's absolutely right. Then there remains, Adamantus, only a very small group who consort with philosophy in a way that's worthy of her, a noble and well-brought-up character, for example, kept down by exile, who remains with philosophy according to his nature because there is no one to corrupt him, or a great soul living in a small city, who disdains the city's affairs and looks beyond them. A very few might be drawn to philosophy from other crafts that they rightly despise because they have good natures, and some might be held back by the bridle that restrains our friend Phæages. For he's in every way qualified to be tempted away from philosophy, but his physical illness restrains him by keeping him out of politics. Finally, my own case is hardly worth mentioning, my demonic sign. because it has happened to no one before me, or to only a few. Now, the members of this small group have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession philosophy is, and at the same time they've also seen the madness of the majority, and realised, in a word, that hardly anyone acts sanely in public affairs, and that there is no ally with whom they might go to the aid of justice and survive, that instead they'd perish before they could profit, either their city or their friends, and be useless both to themselves and to others. Just like a man who has fallen among wild animals, and is neither willing to join them in doing injustice, nor sufficiently strong to oppose the general savagery alone. Taking all this into account, they lead a quiet life, and do their own work. Thus, like someone who takes refuge under a little wall from a storm of dust or hail driven by the wind, the philosopher, seeing others filled with lawlessness, is satisfied if he can somehow lead his present life free from injustice and impious acts, and depart from it with good hope, blameless and content. Well, that's no small thing for him to have accomplished before departing. But it isn't the greatest either, since he doesn't chance upon a constitution that suits him. Under a suitable one, his own growth will be fuller, and he will save the community as well as himself. It seems to me that we've now sensibly discussed the reasons why philosophy is slandered, and why the slanderer is unjust. Unless, of course, you have something else to add. I have nothing else to add on that point. Which of our present constitutions do you think is suitable for philosophers? None of them. That's exactly my complaint. None of our present constitutions is worthy of the philosophic nature, and as a result, this nature is perverted and altered. For just as a foreign seed sown in an alien ground is likely to be overcome by the native species and to fade away among them, so the philosophic nature fails to develop its full power and declines into a different character. But if it were to find the best constitution, as it is itself the best, it would be clear that it really is divine, and that other natures and ways of life are merely human. Obviously, you're going to ask next what the best constitution is. You're wrong there. I wasn't going to ask that. But whether it was the constitution we've described when we were founding our city, or some other one. In the other respects, it is that one. But we've said even then that there must always be some people in the city who have a theory of the Constitution. The same one that guided you, the lawgiver, when you made the laws. We did say that. Yes, but we didn't emphasize it sufficiently, for fear of what your objections have made plain, namely that its proof would be long and difficult, and indeed what remains is by no means easy to go through. What's that? How can a city engage in philosophy without being destroyed? For all great things are prone to fall, and as the saying goes, fine things are really hard to achieve. Nevertheless, to complete our discussion, we'll have to get clear about this. If anything prevents us from doing it, it won't be a lack of willingness, but lack of ability. At least you'll see how willing I am, for notice again how enthusiastically and recklessly I say that the manner in which a city ought to take up the philosophic way of life is opposite of what it does at present. How so? At present, those who study philosophy do so as young men who have just left childhood behind, and have yet to take up household management and money-making. But just when they reach the hardest part, I mean the part that has to do with giving a rational account, they abandon it, and are regarded as fully trained in philosophy. In later life, they think they're doing well, if they are willing to be an invited audience, when others are doing philosophy, for they think that they should do this only as a sideline, and, with a few exceptions, by the time they reach old age, their eagerness for philosophy is quenched more thoroughly than the sun of Heraclitus, which is never rekindled. let's see what the side note about that says. Heraclitus believed that the sun is new every day. The sun not only sets at night, it ceases to exist, being replaced by a totally new sun in the morning. Ah, yes, of course, Heraclitus, the one who believed that all is change. For philosophy is quenched more thoroughly than the sun of Heraclitus, which is never rekindled. Oh, what should they do? Entirely the opposite. As youths and children, they should put their minds to youthful education and philosophy, and take care of their bodies at a time when they are growing into manhood, so as to acquire a helper for philosophy. As they grow older and their souls begin to reach maturity, they should increase their mental exercises. Then, when their strength begins to fail and they have retired from politics and military service, they should graze freely in the pastures of philosophy, and do nothing else. I mean the ones who are to live happy, and, in death, add a fitting destiny in that other place to the life which they have lived. You seem to be speaking with true enthusiasm, Socrates, but I'm sure that most of your hearers, beginning with Thrasymachus, will oppose you, with even greater enthusiasm and not at all be convinced. Don't slander Thrasymachus and me, just as we've become friends. Not that we're enemies before. We won't relax our efforts until we either convince him and the others, or, at any rate, do something that may benefit them in a later incarnation. When reborn, they happen upon these arguments again. That's a short time you're talking about. Well, it's nothing compared to the whole of time. All the same, it's no wonder that the majority of people aren't convinced by our arguments, for they've never seen a man that fits our plan. And the rhymes of this sort that they have heard are usually intended, and not, like this one, the product of mere chance. That is to say, you've never seen a man, or number of men, who themselves rhymed with virtue, were assimilated to it as far as possible, and ruled in a city of the same type. Or do you think they have? I don't think so at all. Nor have they listened sufficiently to fine and free arguments that search out the truth in every way for the sake of knowledge, but that keep away from the sophistications and heuristic quibbles that, both in public trials and in private gatherings, aim at nothing except a reputation and disputation. No, they haven't. It was because of this, because we foresaw these difficulties, that we were afraid. Nonetheless, we were compelled by the truth to say that no city, constitution, or individual man will ever become perfect until either some chance event compels these few philosophers, who aren't vicious, the ones who are now called useless, to take charge of a city, whether they want to or not, and compels the city to obey them, or until a god inspires the present rulers and kings, or their offspring, with a true erotic love for philosophy. Now, it cannot be reasonably maintained, in my view, that either of these things is impossible, but if it could, would be justly ridiculed for indulging in wishful thinking. Isn't that so? It is. Then, if in the limitless past, those who were foremost in philosophy were forced to take charge of a city, or if this is happening now in some foreign place far beyond our ken of it, or if it will happen in the future, we are prepared to maintain our argument that, at whatever time the muse of philosophy controls a city, the constitution we've described will also exist at that time, whether it is past, present, or future. Since it is not impossible for this to happen, we are not speaking of impossibilities. That is, that it is difficult for it to happen. However, we agree. That's my opinion anyway. But the majority don't share your opinion. Is that what you're going to say? Well, they probably don't. You should not make such wholesale charges against the majority, for they'll no doubt come to a different opinion, if, instead of indulging your love of victory at their expense, you soothe them and try to remove their slanderous prejudice against the love of learning, by pointing out what you mean by a philosopher and by defining the philosophic nature and way of life as we just did now, so that they'll realise that you don't mean the same people they do, and, if once they see it your way, even if you will say that they'll have a different opinion from the one you just attributed to them, and will answer differently, or do you think that anyone who is gentle and without malice is harsh with someone who is neither irritable nor malicious? I'll anticipate your answer and say that a few people may have such a harsh character, but not the majority. Sorry. I'll anticipate your answer and say that a few people may have such a harsh character, but not the majority. And of course I'd agree. Then don't you also agree that the harshness the majority exhibit towards philosophy is caused by those outsiders who don't belong and who have burst in like a band of revellers, always abusing one another, indulging in their love of quarrels, and arguing about human beings in a way that is wholly inappropriate to philosophy? I do indeed. No one whose thoughts are truly directed towards the things that are, Adamantus, has the leisure to look down at human affairs, or to be filled with envy and hatred by competing with people. Instead, as he looks and studies things that are organised and always the same, that neither do injustice to one another nor suffer it, being all in a rational order, he imitates them and tries to become like them as he can. Or do you think that someone can consort with things he admires without imitating them? I do not. It's impossible. Then the philosopher, by consorting with what is ordered and divine, and despite all the slanders around him that say otherwise, he himself becomes as divine and ordered as a human being can. That's absolutely true. And if he should come to be compelled to put what he sees there into people's characters, whether into a single person or into a populace, instead of shaping only his own, do you think that he will be a poor craftsman of moderation, justice, and the whole of virtue? He least of all. And when the majority realise that what we are saying about the philosopher is true, will they be harsh with him, mistrust him, when we say that the city will never find happiness until its outline is sketched by painters who use the divine model? No, they won't be harsh at all, if indeed they realise this. But what sort of sketch do you mean? They take the city and the characters of human beings as their sketching slate, but first they'd wipe it clean, which isn't an easy thing to do. And you should know that this is the plain difference between them and the others, namely that they refuse to take either an individual or a city in hand, or to write laws unless they receive a clean slate, or are allowed to clean it themselves. And they'd be right to refuse. Then don't you think they'd next sketch the outline of the Constitution? Of course. And I suppose that, as they work, they look often in each direction towards the natures of justice, beauty, moderation, and the like, on the one hand, and towards those they're trying to put into human beings on the other. And in this way they'd mix and blend the various ways of life in the city until they've produced a human image based on what Homer too called the divine form and image, and when it occurred among human beings. That's right. They'd erase one thing, I suppose, and draw in another, until they've made characters for human beings that the gods would love as much as possible. At any rate, that would certainly result in the finest sketch. Then, is this at all persuasive to those you said were straining to attack us? That the person we were praising is really a painter of constitutions? They were angry because we entrusted the city to him. Are they any calmer now that they've heard what we had to say? Oh, they'll be much calmer if they had any moderation. Indeed, how could they possibly dispute it? Will they deny that philosophers are lovers of what is, or of the truth? That would be absurd. Or that their nature, as we've described it, is close to the best. They can't deny that either. Or that such a nature, if it follows its own way of life, isn't as completely good and philosophic as any other, or that the people we excluded are more so. No, certainly not. Then, will they still be angry with us when we say that? Until philosophers take control of a city, there'll be no respite from evil for either city or citizens, and the constitutions we've been describing in theory will never be completed in practice. I suppose they'll probably be less angry. Then, if it's all right with you, let's not say that they'll simply be less angry, but that they'll become altogether gentle and persuaded, so that they'll be shamed into agreeing with us, if nothing else. That's all right with me. I'll drink some water. Where was I? It's all right with me. Let's assume, therefore, that they've been convinced on this point. Will anyone dispute our view that the offspring of kings or rulers could be born with philosophic natures? No one would do that. Could anyone claim that if such offspring are born, they'll inevitably be corrupted? We agree ourselves that it's hard for them to be saved from corruption, but could anyone else claim that in the whole of time, not one of them could be saved? How could he? But surely one such individual would be sufficient to bring to completion all the things that now seem so incredible, provided that his city obeys him. One should be sufficient. If a ruler established the laws and ways of life we've described, it is surely not impossible that the citizens would be willing to carry them out. Not at all. And would it be either astonishing or impossible that others should think as we do? I don't suppose it would. But I think our earlier discussion was sufficient to show that these arrangements are best, if only they are possible. Indeed it was. Then we can conclude that this legislation is best, if only it is possible, and that, while it is hard for it to come about, it is not impossible. We can. Now that the difficulty has been disposed of, we must deal with what remains, namely, how the saviours of our constitution will come to be in the city, what subjects and way of life will cause them to come into being, and at what ages they'll take up each of them. Indeed we must. It wasn't very clever of me to omit from our earlier discussion the troublesome topics of acquiring wives, begetting children, and appointing rulers, just because I knew the whole truth would provoke resentment and would be hard to bring about in practice, for, as it turned out, I had to go through these matters anyway. The subjects of women and children has been adequately dealt with, but that of the rulers has to be taken up again from the beginning. We said, if you remember, that they must show themselves to be lovers of the city, when tested by pleasure and pain, that they must hold on to their resolve through labours, fears, and all other adversities. Anyone who is incapable of doing so was to be rejected, while anyone who came through unchanged, like gold tested in a fire, was to be made ruler and receive prizes, both while he lived and after his death. These were the sort of things we were saying, while our argument, afraid of stirring up the very problems that now confronts us, veiled its face and slipped by. That's very true, I do remember. We hesitated to say the things we've now dared to say anyway. So let's now also dare to say that those who are to be made our guardians, in the most exact sense of the term, must be philosophers. Let's do it. Then, you should understand that there will probably be only a few of them, for they have to have the nature we've described, and its parts mostly grow in separation and are rarely found in one person. What do you mean? You know that ease of learning, good memory, quick wits, smartness, youthful passion and high-mindedness, and all the other things that go along with these, are rarely willing to grow together in a mind that will choose an orderly life that is quiet and completely stable, for the people who possess the former traits are carried by their quick wits wherever chance leads them, and have no stability at all. That's true. On the other hand, people with stable characters who don't change easily, who aren't easily frightened in battle, and whom one would employ because of their greater reliability, exhibit similar traits when it comes to learning. They are as hard to move and teach as people whose brains have become numb, and they are filled with sleep and yawning whenever they have to learn anything. That's so. Yet we say that someone must have a fine and goodly share of both characters, or he won't receive the truest education, honours, or rule. That's right. Then don't you think that such people will be quite rare? Of course. Therefore, they must be tested in the labours, fears, and pleasures we've mentioned previously, but they must also be exercised in many other subjects, which we didn't mention but are adding now, to see whether they can tolerate the most important subjects, or will shrink from them like the cowards who shrink from other tests. It's important to examine them like that, but what do you mean by the most important subjects? Do you remember when we distinguished three parts in the soul, in order to help bring about what justice, moderation, courage, and wisdom each is. If I didn't remember that, it wouldn't be just for me to hear the rest. What about what preceded it? Sorry, what about what preceded it? What was that? We said, I believe, that in order to get the finest possible view of these matters, we need to take a longer road that would make them plain to anyone who took it, but that it was possible to give demonstrations of what they are that would be up to the standard of the previous argument. And you said that it would be satisfactory, so it seems to me that our discussion at that time fell short of exactness, but whether or not it satisfied you is for you to say. I thought you gave us good measure, and so, apparently, did the others. Any measure of such things that falls short in any way of that, which is not good measure. For nothing incomplete is the measure of anything, although people are sometimes of the opinion that an incomplete treatment is nonetheless adequate, and make further investigation unnecessary. Indeed, laziness causes many people to think that. It is a thought that a guardian of a city and its laws can well do without. Probably so. Well then, he must take a longer road, and put as much effort into learning as into physical training, for otherwise, as we were just saying, he will never reach the goal of the most important subject, and the most appropriate one for him to learn. Aren't these virtues, then, the most important things? He asked. Is there anything even more important than justice and the other virtues we discussed? There is something more important. However, even for the virtues themselves, it isn't enough to look at a mere sketch, as we did before, while neglecting the most complete account. It's ridiculous, isn't it, to strain every nerve to attain the utmost exactness and clarity about other things of little value, and not to consider the most important things worthy of the greatest exactness. It certainly is. But do you think that anyone is going to let you off without asking you what this most important subject is, and what it concerns? No, indeed. And you can ask me too. You've certainly heard the answer often enough. But now either you aren't thinking, or you intend to make trouble for me again by interrupting. And I suspect the latter, for you often heard it said that the form of the good is the most important thing to learn about. And that it's by their relation to it that the just things and the others become useful and beneficial. You know very well that I am... turning the next page. That I am going to say this. And besides, that we have no adequate knowledge of it. And you also know that, if we don't know it, even the fullest possible knowledge of other things is of no benefit to us, any more than if we acquire any possession without the good of it. Or do you think that it is any advantage to have every kind of possession without the good of it? Or to know everything except the good, thereby knowing nothing fine or good? No, by God, I don't. Furthermore, you certainly know that the majority believe that pleasure is the good, while the more sophisticated believe that it is knowledge. Indeed, I do. And you know that those who believe this can't tell us what sort of knowledge it is. However, but in the end are forced to say that it is knowledge of the good. And that's ridiculous. Of course it is. They blame us for not knowing the good, and then turn around and talk to us as if we did know it. They say that it is knowledge of the good, as if we understand what they're speaking about when they utter the word good. That's completely true. What about those who define the good as pleasure? Are they any less full of confusion than the others? Aren't they even forced to admit that there are bad pleasures? Most definitely. So I think they have to agree that the same things are both good and bad, isn't that true? Of course. It's clear then, isn't it? Why, there are many large controversies about this. How could it be otherwise? And isn't this also clear? In the case of just and beautiful things, many people are content with what are believed to be so, even if they aren't really so, and they act, acquire, and form their own beliefs on that basis. Nobody is satisfied to acquire things that are merely believed to be good, however, but everyone wants the things that are truly good, and disdains mere belief. That's right. Every soul pursues the good and does its utmost for its sake. It divines that the good is something, but it is perplexed and cannot adequately grasp what it is, or acquire the sort of stable beliefs it has about other things, and so it misses the benefit, if any, that even those other things may give. Will we allow the best people in the city, to whom we entrust everything, to be so in the dark about something of this kind, and of this importance? That's the last thing we'd do. I don't suppose, at least, that just and fine things will have acquired much of a guardian in someone who doesn't even know in what way they are good. And I divine that no one will have adequate knowledge of them until he knows this. You've divined well. But won't our constitution be perfectly ordered if a guardian who knows these things is in charge of it? Necessarily. But Socrates, you must also tell us whether you consider the good to be knowledge, or pleasure, or something else altogether. What a man. It's been clear for some time that other people's opinions about these matters won't satisfy you. Well, Socrates, it doesn't seem right to me for you to be willing to state other people's convictions but not your own, especially when you've spent so much time occupied with these matters. What? Do you think it's right to talk about things one doesn't know as if one does know them? Not as if one knows them, he said, but one ought to be willing to state one's opinions as such. What? Haven't you noticed that opinions without knowledge are shameful and ugly things? The best of them are blind. Or do you think that those who express a true opinion without understanding are any different from blind people who happen to travel the right road? Well, they're no different at all. Do you want to look at shameful, blind, and crooked things, then, when you might hear illuminating and fine ones from other people? By God, Socrates, Glaucon said, don't desert us with the end almost in sight. We'll be satisfied if you discuss the good as you discuss justice, moderation, and the rest. That, my friend, I said, would satisfy me too, but I'm afraid I won't be up to it, and that I'll disgrace myself and look ridiculous by trying. So please abandon this quest for what the good is itself. That is for the time being. For even to arrive at my own view about it is too big a topic for the discussion we are now started on. But I am willing to tell you about what is apparently an offspring of the good, and most like it. Is that agreeable to you, or would you rather we let the whole matter drop? It is. The story about the father remains, a debt you'll pay another time. I wish that I could pay the debt in full, and you receive it instead of just the interest. So here then is the child and offspring of the good. But be careful about that I don't somehow deceive you unintentionally by giving you an illegitimate account of the child. Oh, there's a funny side note here. Throughout, Socrates is punning on the word tokos, which means either child or interest on capital loan. We'll be as careful as possible. Speak on. I will, when we've come to an agreement and recalled some things that we've already said, both here and many other times. Which ones? We say that there are many beautiful things, and many good things, and so on for each kind, and in this way we distinguish them in words. Hold on, looks like we're getting into the deep part of the philosophy now. I have to pay attention. I'm going to drink some water. All in all, this book has been surprisingly light. We've actually only got a couple more pages to go, but it looks like these next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages are going to be a bit deeper, so let's put on our thinking caps and hope we understand some stuff. Alright. We say that there are many beautiful things, and many good things, and so on, for each kind. And in this way we distinguish them in words. I don't know whether I like it more when it's deep with layered meaning, or when it takes forever to get to a point they could have just said. Indeed, sometimes I enjoy the fluff, because you get to learn about this character of Socrates, and he's quite a lovable guy. But at the same time, there's no philosophy in it. Whereas the deep stuff is where you really learn something. And so on and so for each kind. In this way we distinguish them in words. We do. And beauty itself, and good itself, and all the things we thereby set down as many, reversing ourselves, we set down according to a single form of each, believing that there is but one, and call it the being of each. That's true. And we say that the many beautiful things and the rest are visible but not intelligible, while the forms are intelligible but not visible. That's completely true. With what part of ourselves do we see visible things? With our sight. And so audible things are heard by hearing, and so on with our other senses. We perceive all the perceptible things. That's right. Have you considered how lavish the maker of our senses was in making the power to see and be seen? I can't say I have. Well, consider it this way. Do hearing and sound need another kind of thing in order for the former to hear and the latter to be heard? A third thing in whose absence the one won't hear or the other be heard? Oh no, they don't need anything else. And if there are any others that need such a thing, there can't be many of them. Can you think of one? I can't. You don't realise that sight and the visible have such a need? How so? Sight may be present in the eyes, and the one who has it may try to use it, and colours may be present in things, but unless a third kind of thing is present, which is naturally adapted for this purpose, you know that sight will see nothing, and colours will remain unseen. What kind of thing do you mean? I mean what you call light. Aha, you're right. Then, it isn't an insignificant kind of link that connects the sense of sight and the power to be seen. It is a more valuable link than any other links things have, if indeed light is something valuable. And of course, it's very valuable. Which of the gods in heaven would you name as the cause and controller of this? The one whose light causes our sight to see in the best way, and the visible things to be seen? Oh, the same one you and the others would name. Obviously, the answer to your question is Helios. That is the sun. And isn't sight by nature related to that god in this way? Which way? Sight isn't the sun. Neither sight itself, nor that in which it comes to be, namely the eye. No, it certainly isn't. But I think it is the most sun-like of the senses. Very much so. And it receives from the sun the power it has, just like an influx from an overflowing treasury. Certainly. The sun is not sight, but isn't it the cause of sight itself, and seen by it? That's right. Let's say, then, that this is what I called the offspring of the good, which the good begot as its analogue. What the good itself is, in the intelligible realm, in relation to understanding and intelligible things, the sun is in the visible realm, in relation to sight and visible things. How? Explain a bit more. You know that when we turn our eyes to things whose colours are no longer illuminated by the light of day, but by night lights, the eyes are dimmed and seem nearly blind, as if clear vision were no longer among them. Of course. Yet, whenever one turns them on things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and vision appears in those very same eyes. Indeed. Well, understand the soul in the same way. When it focuses on something illuminated by truth, and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, on what comes to be and passes away, it opines and is dimmed, changes its opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. It does seem that way. So that what gives truth to the things known, and the power to the knower, is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. So here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good-like, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. This is an inconceivably beautiful thing you're talking about. If it provides both knowledge and truth and is superior to them in beauty, you surely don't think that a thing like that could be pleasure. Hush! Let's examine its image in more detail as follows. How? You'll be willing to say, I think, that the sun not only provides visible things with the power to be seen, but also with coming to be, growth, and nourishment, although it is itself not coming to be. How could it be? Therefore, you should also say that not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being to the good, but their being is also due to it, although the good is not being, but superior to it in rank and power. And Glaucon comically said, "By Apollo, what a demonic superiority!" It's your fault. You forced me to tell you my opinion about it. And I don't want you to stop either, so do continue to explain its similarity to the sun, if you have omitted anything. I'm certainly omitting a lot. Well, don't. Not even the smallest thing. I think I'll have to omit a fair bit, but as far as possible at the moment, I won't omit anything voluntarily. Don't. Understand, then, that as we've said, there are these two things, one sovereign of the intelligible kind and place, the other of the visible. I don't say of heaven, so as to not seem to you to be playing the sophist with the name. In any case, you have two kinds of things, visible and intelligible. Right. It is like a line divided into two unequal sections. Here's a line depicted below, and you can't see the line, but I'm going to have to tell you now. Imagine here, because he's got a drawing of this line, imagine here a vertical line, like a sort of graph, and with some tally marks on it. At the top, you have understanding. Below that, you have thought. Below that, you have belief. And below that, at the bottom, you have imagination. Yeah, so imagine a vertical line at the top, understanding, thought, belief, imagination. It is like a line divided into two unequal sections. Then divide each section, namely that of the visible and that of the intelligible, in the same ratio as the line. Also, the how would I describe this? If we imagine plotting it on the graph, and going from bottom to top, with imagination at the bottom, if we were to plot imagination at point 1 on y-axis, and then you plot belief on point 3, and then thought on plot 10, and then understanding on plot 100. And you can see there's a sort of, it gets increasingly bigger. That's the line. That's the distribution of the line. That makes any sense. Can't show any images here. It is like a line divided into two unequal sections. Then divide each section, namely that of the visible and that of the intelligible, in the same ratio as the line. In terms now of relative clarity and opacity, one subsection of the visible consists of images, and by images I mean first shadows, then reflections in water, and in all close-packed, smooth and shiny materials and everything of that sort, if you understand. I do. You know, you're right, I can do that, actually. I didn't think of that. One memento. Do I have my art program? Yeah, I do. It looked something like this. This is the drawing they had. Hang on. I do own a tablet. Do I own a tablet pen, though, on this table here? This is what was drawn in the book. That's what they drew in the book. You see the difference gets bigger. Not sure the significance of it yet, but that was the illustration in the book. Yeah, I suppose so. I suppose so. Or actually, I don't think... Sorry, I did make a mistake there. They're not along the points. They're along the spaces in between the points, as if they were, like, mass or something. I've closed the program now, so... Fuck it, whatever. I do. In the other subsection of the visible, put the originals of these images. Namely the animals around us, all the plants, and the whole class of manufactured things. Consider them put. Would you be willing to say that, as regards truth and untruth, the division is in this proportion, as the opinable is to the knowable, so the likeness is to the things that it is like? Certainly. Consider now the section of the intelligible is to be divided. Consider now how the section of the intelligible is to be divided. How so? As follows. In one subsection, the soul, using as images the things that were imitated before, is forced to investigate from hypotheses, proceeding not to a first principle, but to a conclusion. In the other subsection, however, it makes its way to a first principle that is not a hypothesis, proceeding from a hypothesis but without the images used in the previous subsection, using forms themselves and making it its investigation through them. I don't fully understand what you mean. Let's try again. You understand it more easily after the following preamble. I think you know that students of geometry, calculation, and the like hypothesize the odd and the even, the various figures, the three kinds of angles, and other things akin to these in each of their investigations, as if they knew them. They make their hypotheses, and don't think it necessary to give any account of them, either to themselves or to others, as if they were clear to everyone. And, going from these principles, through the remaining steps, they arrive in full agreement. I certainly know that much. Then you also know that, although they use visible figures and make claims about them, their thought isn't directed to them, but to the other things that they are like. They make their claims for the sake of the square itself and the diagonal itself. Not the diagonal they draw, or similarly with the others, these figures that they make and draw, of which shadows and reflections in waters are images, they now in turn use as images, in seeking to see those others themselves, that one cannot see except by means of thought. That's true. This, then, is the kind of thing that, on the one hand, I say is intelligible, and on the other hand, is such that the soul is forced to use hypotheses in the investigation of it, not travelling up to a first principle, since it cannot reach beyond its hypotheses, but using as images those very things which images were made in the section below, and which, by comparison to their images, were thought to be clear and valued as such. I understand that you mean what happens in... Sorry, that was not Socrates speaking just then. I understand what you mean, what happens in geometry and related sciences. Then also understand that, by the other subsection of the intelligible, I mean that what reason itself grasps by the power of the dialectic. It does not consider these hypotheses as first principles, but truly as hypotheses, but as stepping stones to take off from, enabling it to reach the unhypothetical first principle of everything. Having grasped this principle, it reverses itself, and keeping hold of what follows from it, comes down to a conclusion without making use of anything visible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on from forms to forms, and ending in forms. I understand, if not yet adequately, for in my opinion you're speaking of an enormous task, that you want to distinguish the intelligible parts of that which is, the part studied by the science or dialectic, as clearer than the part studied by the so-called sciences, for which their hypotheses are first principles. And although those who study the objects of those sciences are forced to do so by means of thought, rather than sense perception, still, because they do not go back to a genuine first principle, but proceed from hypotheses, you don't think that they understand them, even though, given such a principle, they are intelligible. And you seem to me to call the state of geometers thought, but not understanding. Thought being intermediate between opinion and understanding. Your exposition is most adequate. Thus, there are 4 such conditions in the soul, corresponding to the 4 subsections of our line: understanding for the highest, thought for the second, belief for the third, and imagining for the last. Arrange them in a ratio, and consider that each shares in clarity to the degree that the subsection it is set over shares in truth. I understand, and arrange them as you say. Alright, that's the end of the book. It looks like their conversation is going to continue, but that's in the next book. I can't read the next book, otherwise I will destroy my voice, but that was a little less deep than I expected. I thought they were going to go into, he's really edging us here, isn't he? You know, he refuses to speak of the things he wants to speak about because he knows we're going to get desperate for it. A classic Socrates move. I literally brought out a chart. You should have been here for... Oh, what one was it? I think it might have been the Gorgias or the Meno. It was the Meno, definitely the Meno, where they start doing geometry in the sand on the earth. He brings someone over and he tells them to start drawing start drawing rectangles and dividing lines between them and stuff like that. He was making a point about how even though the boy had not been taught any geometry, he was still able to perform geometrical tasks through his own intuition and his own capacity for knowledge. Well, okay, that was my view at least. Socrates' view was that the boy was capable of doing it because he had learned geometry in a past life, and he was simply recalling knowledge. Which, I don't know, I'm not sure I buy that. I think I buy it in the same way that that a calculator can do maths, because it is born with the ability to do maths, but through very basic principles of ones and zeros, and perhaps in the same way humans are also able to do that. Perhaps we have some capacity for very primitive mathematics, and we have, through either education or just observing the world, we have made those ideas more complex. Well, that's my view, at least. I think it's a very, very psychological view, I think, rather than philosophical. I like to stay grounded in reality. But that was good. That was quite a fun one. Well, actually, no. I disagree completely. The last part was kind of fun, but the first hour of it, I feel like there was no philosophy in there at all. That was very, very lots of fluff. That was I jinxed it. You know that? I jinxed it. It was what were they talking about? I'm gonna have to go reread it a second time to take my notes, but I think I jinxed it. I said what's he got about erotic love for philosophy? I think he's gone off the deep end this time. He's huffing the fumes. he spent too much time in Alcibiades' house. Oh yeah, he's like it's like someone who is a true lover. He would love the boy he loves, right? It's like okay, what about women? I don't think Socrates has ever mentioned any kind of love for women. It's entirely men. Guy's completely mad. Oh, well, that's good. Yeah, I jinxed it. I said at the start of the book, I said, well, these have been getting more and more difficult with each book. And then we go and read this one, and aside from the last part, which I'll be honest, I didn't actually understand, it was really quite easy. So, oh well, surely book 7 will be very difficult. We're surely at the part where I think I forget which one it was, but it was a really old from like a year ago or something I was reading where he did describe the cave story, the allegory of the cave. But I suspect he is also going to mention it in the Republic, because everyone knows about it, and the only Plato book people read is the allegory of the cave, so it must surely be in there. But that was that. Let's see. I doubt anyone's streaming because it's dead hours. We always raid Don Koala because he's the only guy I follow who's ever online, so I guess we have no choice. Let's see. Mute ad. I don't wanna watch an ad. We'll wait 30 seconds. Book 7 is just going to be the part where he describes goodness. You're probably right. You're probably right. He's definitely been hinting that so we've learned about the child of the good. Now we're going to learn about the good itself. You're probably right there. He's probably going to talk about the good itself, and if he's talking about it itself, he's surely going to have to describe the theory of forms, which means the allegory of the cave. Surely we'll get into his metaphysics. Fine, after eternity of stuff. Well, anyway, let's read Don Koala. Koala Channel. Whoosh. I can't remember. I think at some point he's gonna have to bring it back to justice and stuff. So I imagine like it'll just sort of, I don't know. Anyway,